Dovetail alignment boards are one of those tools that really make a big difference. They're repeatable. If your tailboard slips while you're marking out your pins, you can just push it back against the fence and know it's right in the exact same location. When I was in Ohio last year with David Picciuto, I gave him one I had just made. I've got some projects coming up that's going to require some dovetails, and so I thought it was time to make a new one. This is one of those ones where I wanted to make it as fancy as possible. So I grabbed some zebra wood and some Mexican ebony I'd been saving and started to mill them up. And later on you'll see I decide to inlay some abalone. Now you could make a dovetail alignment board that is any two boards that are 90 degrees to each other that have a coplanar fence on one side. It could be fancy like the one I'm making here, or it could be as simple as two pieces of plywood butt jointed together with a fence on one side. As you're milling your lumber, it's not important that they're the same thickness, but it is really important that your boards are the exact same width. So here I'm getting everything milled up and square in preparation for a little trick I like to use to ensure squareness. Cutting a rabbet into your tailboard is a great way to ensure that you start with a square reference area. I'm going to show you some other reasons why that rabbet comes in really handy. I'm going to put in a flat bottomed blade here to mill up that rabbet, and I'm going to show you how I lay out for it. Using a set of calipers, I can set my marking gauge to 1/3 of the width of my tailboard and mark that out on the end grain. And then using the width of my pin board, I can mark out how deep the rabbet's going to go. And this allows me to easily set the depth of my saw blade and the width of my stop block. Put a link in the description to all the tools I used in this video, like this 3-in-1 shoulder plane I used to clean up the rabbet, ensuring that we have two reference areas that are 90 degrees to each other. So now we get to the fun part, which is cutting some dovetails. I'm going to be using the jig I created, the Katz-Moses magnetic dovetail jig. I laid these out kind of irregularly from the center, but equal distances from that middle pin. Dovetail layout is one of those things I get a lot of questions about, and really all that matters is you like the way it looks. I decided to go with the 8-to-1 angle on this one, and I like to start the saw and then slide the jig up to it. It really helps ensure that you're sawing in the correct location. I then cleared out the waste with this new Concepts fret saw, which is really a game changer in the coping saw arena. And here we see one of the many great advantages of using a rabbet in dovetails. You can reference off of it to cut your shoulder at the perfect spot. And then again, reference your chisel off of it so you know that you're the perfect plane with your marking gauge line. One great feature of my jig is that it can be used as a chisel guide for all aspects of dovetails: pins, tails, shoulders. And here's one of the old dovetail alignment boards I made in action. Another great feature about this rabbet is you can just slide it right up and you know it's locked right in place. The fence on the left-hand side keeps those two in line. Even if your tailboard slips while you're marking out, you can put it back exactly where it was before and know you're right on. It's important to remember when you're using a rabbet in your dovetails that the thickness of your pins are going to be different than your tails, so you need to reset your marking gauge. Remember to mark out your waist on the top of your board so you cut on the correct side of the line. Again, I like to start the saw and then slide the jig up to it. This really helps keep the saw in the correct place. I always say your marking knife line is like your neighbor's fence. You can touch it, but you can't go over it. I made a video on this little trick here using the tip of your saw as a depth guide. It's really helpful in having clean dovetails, and it's a great little trick. There's a link to the video down in the description. You can see my bedazzled apron there from my last video. Holding the jig firmly with just downward pressure is really all you should need. It's pretty simple and doesn't take a lot of pressure to keep it in the right place. When using your coping saw, line up the frame with your marking gauge line and you know you'll be cutting parallel to where you need to be. When you're cleaning out waste between your dovetails, you really want to get as close to your marking gauge line without going over, and then set your chisel down into the line. It's going to really help you get clean, parallel cuts across your marking gauge lines. I'll show you a close-up here in a second, but the closer you can get to your marking gauge line, the cleaner it's going to be. The magnetic jig can be used as a guide for clearing out waste by flipping it over. Put your chisel in the marking gauge line and slide the jig up to it. You know you're cutting at a perfect 90 degrees. Here I am getting as close to the line as possible until finally dropping into that marking gauge line, and then finally very slowly cleaning out my corners so as not to bruise them. And here I'm going to use the magnetic guide to trim one of my pins down. This is a great way to do it because you know that you're trimming at the perfect angle. And then I use my square to make sure I have no high spots between my pins. Glue it up, making sure that everything is very square. Again, this is really the most important part of it. Everything else is just flair after that. What do you think, Video Jonathan? So we're just going to clean everything up and make sure it's square. This zebra wood was such a nightmare. I really tried to stay away with it with the plane because you could look at it funny and it would tear out. So I just used a card scraper to do some final cleanup. I'm good to go. So now we're going to go ahead and cut our fences. These don't really matter as long as they're flat on the side facing the tables of your jig. I chose to go about 1/10 of an inch taller than the tables of my dovetail alignment board. You really don't want them to be any taller than the thinnest board you're going to cut dovetails in. Otherwise, you won't be able to close your vise. Sometimes I'll cut dovetails in some really thin boards for like small jewelry boxes or really teeny drawers. So I wanted the option to be able to really get some thin boards in there. And for added decoration, I'm going to go ahead and cut some 45s about halfway up the width of these fences. I'm going to use a magnetic shooting board I made. It's really neat. You can do 45-degree angles, 90-degree angles. It's got magnets in it so your saw stays square and plumb, and it's really a useful little. If you're interested in seeing a video on how it's made, let me know down in the comments. We'll do a little last minute cleaning up with a card scraper and then get ready for glue up. With small glue ups like this, I like to use a little super glue along with my wood glue. And that way, once the super glue sets, you know you're in the right spot and you can clamp without worrying about it moving all over the place. So we'll glue it up here and get ready to put in our abalone. I like to keep these 6mm abalone dots laying around. I left a link down in the description. They're used for fretboards on guitars, and they're great accents to projects. They really look good. So I used some 5-minute epoxy over the top of them, and then used a blowtorch to take the bubbles out. Usually I'd use West Systems for anything bigger than this, but because these are so small, 5-minute epoxy was just fine. After about 30 minutes of cure time, I went ahead and hit him with a block plane, trying to stay well away from the wood given the tear out problems with that zebra wood. I ended up hitting this with a little bit of sandpaper later just to give it a final cleanup and chamfer the edges. But now it's the fun part. We're going to go ahead and throw some finish on this. I like to use de-wax shellac because it dries quickly, it gives a good layer of protection, and it looks really good. And here's the money shot. This is the best part of any project. Putting finish on it and seeing what it looks like. I really think this zebra wood and Mexican ebony were such a great contrast to each other. The dark and light wood with the abalone just really came out looking beautiful. And then the thin pins on the dovetails really just bring this whole thing together. Thank you so much for watching. I really had a fun time building this dovetail alignment board. If this is your first time here, please subscribe. We've got a lot of great content coming out. For behind the scenes, look at what we're up to here in the shop. Check me out on Instagram at Katz-Moses. Here's a couple of my past videos for you to watch. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day.